Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of ClearHead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Over the last 5 years, hospital visits related to eating disorders has doubled, and those being diagnosed are getting younger and often presenting with a more serious condition. The reasons for why someone develops an eating disorder is a complicated process with psychological, biological, genetic, and social cultural factors at play. It is also important to acknowledge that it is a long and difficult process when supporting a loved one on their recovery journey. In this episode, we will hear from Genevieve Mora as she shares her personal journey to recovery and her advice for any individuals dealing with an eating disorder. Jan spent most of her teenage years trying to manage both her OCD and anorexia nervosa. As part of her recovery, she has made it her mission to offer hope for those who are struggling themselves. Jan co-founded Voices of Hope, and through this platform, she uses her lived experience to show people that recovery is possible and that there is no shame in having a mental illness. Jan is the author of Bite Back, a compassionate guide to navigating eating disorders, and the co-creator of Love Your Kite, an eating disorder resource app. Alongside Jazz Thornton, her co-founder, she was named in 2023 Forbes Asia 30 Under 30. Welcome, Jen.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm turning 30 this year, and you've just reminded me of that. So, thank you. But I'm honoured to be here and to be invited to have this conversation because it's obviously something I'm very passionate about.
That's really great. Maybe to kick us off, I really want you to kind of just feel free to share with us. How did you get onto this journey to start with?
Yeah, great question. So my sort of journey with mental illness or mental health challenges began around the age of 10 years old. I was a very happy kid, a cheeky kid. I had no worries in the world. And there's a moment in my journey that I pinpoint as the sort of beginning of where things started for me. And I'd walked into the kitchen one night, again around the age of 10 years old, to ask my dad what he was cooking for dinner. And as I walked in, a breaking news piece hit the TV screen. And what proceeded was a very graphic and far too detailed, especially for the 6 p.m. news, piece of content or a story in which a child had been hurt. And I pinpoint that as the beginning of my journey because it's the first time I remember feeling this awful feeling of anxiety, butterflies in my stomach, sweaty palms, a sort of instant headache. And that night when I went to bed, usually I'd get into bed and brush my teeth and, go to sleep, whereas I had this urge to get out of bed and check my room to make sure I was safe. And as things progressed, and we can get deeper into this, I started engaging in these behaviors with a genuine fear that if I didn't, myself or my family were going to be hurt like I'd seen on the news, and was eventually diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. And later in my teenage years, or in my mid-teenage years, was diagnosed with a debilitating eating disorder. And in terms of how I got to sort of where I am today, it's a big question, but shame was something that really consumed me. I was incredibly embarrassed, for the lack of a better word, to have fought what I had gone through. I felt like there was no reason for me to have been unwell. I've got beautiful parents. I've come from a lot of privilege, which I think is important to acknowledge. I had everything I needed at my fingertips, and yet I still was really, really struggling. And so when I found recovery and was free from what I'd kind of gone through as a teenager, I was connected with a mutual friend, and we decided that we needed to start something that really would have helped us when we were younger, a place to hear stories of hope and stories that could remind us that we weren't the only ones that were going through what we were going through, and that life can be good again.
Thank you for sharing that. And I love hearing it from a place where that shame no longer has a hold on you, in the sense that you've embraced it as part of who you are, and then use it for good, basically. And we'll obviously delve into all those different parts. But maybe to start off, it would be good to kind of understand from your perspective, why do you think that, you sort of started on that journey in the context of, developing an eating disorder? You mentioned that it was one way in which that you felt you could control the traumatic things that you saw and felt. Maybe you could share a little bit about what that meant in those early journeys. As we know, there are many different types of eating disorders, so I'll leave you to speak on your side of the story.
Awesome. Thank you, Angela. So my experience was with anorexia nervosa, and although I'll never really know sort of why it happened to be, there's a saying I love, and it's that biology loads a gun and the environment pulls the trigger. And I'm not a clinician, but I can speak to my own lived experience and the way that I guess I've made this make sense in my own head. Like I said, anxiety was something that was very prevalent from the sort of age of 10 years old. And my OCD gave me a very perceived sense of control over my anxiety for a short period of time, because in my experience and many others, the way that my OCD worked is you'd have this awful thought, you'd then engage in this behavior, you'd get this temporary release of anxiety, but then the process would start again. So it felt like it was fixing things when often it was doing, the absolute opposite, because it was becoming more ingrained. And so, the way that I kind of look at it and don't know for sure is that, I just felt so out of control in so many aspects of my life that my mind went looking for control in other areas of my life. Like I was always a really sort of excelling student, bit of a perfectionist. If I did things, I wanted to do them really, really well. And unfortunately, ended up being diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, which became an incredibly challenging journey for me throughout, my teenage years. And I think what's really important to acknowledge, especially, now that I'm in the well place I am, and what I learned very quickly throughout my journey is that control that I thought my eating disorder was giving me was actually not control at all. There's nothing more out of control than, fighting an eating disorder. So it was very much a perceived sense of control. But very quickly I learned how much it had gripped onto multiple elements of my life, whether it be, isolating me, pulling me away from friends and hobbies that I loved, and just losing myself for so many of my years. But yeah, Angela, like you were saying, there are many different types of eating disorders, and my experience was with anorexia. And I think, when we look at media and we look at things in the public eye, it's often anorexia that is, I don't know if glamorized is the right word, but it's the one that's sort of publicized the most. It's the one that gets the most attention, again, for lack of a better word. Whereas there are multiple different eating disorder diagnoses, from bulimia to avoidant restrictive food intake disorder to binge eating disorder to OSFED to pica to rumination disorder. And, what I always like to remind people is if you're fighting an eating disorder, you are incredibly unwell, regardless of your weight, regardless of whether you're eating food or not, because, contrary to popular belief, most people with an eating disorder still nourish themselves. We've got a long way to go in terms of changing misconceptions and stereotypes and educating people on what actually an eating disorder is.
And as you mentioned, basically, that this is not something that it's just about someone wanting to look good. It actually was being driven by sort of more underlying challenges that you were facing about your mental health, and being able to tackle both is a really core part of that recovery journey. You talk about some of the challenges that you had faced. So maybe you could share with me a little bit about what are those challenges, so that others can kind of potentially identify and recognize if others are struggling with an eating disorder. Social isolation was one of the things that you mentioned, but it'd be interesting to hear what are the other challenges you felt you faced.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it's important to acknowledge that this will look different for everyone. I think for me, I'd been a food-loving child. I'd never had any issues with food. And during, my journey with an eating disorder, there was a lot of excuses made around meal times, whether it's I've already eaten or I'm not hungry, certain food groups that perhaps I started to avoid. I think social isolation was a big part of it. I became very tearful, very sort of angry, very short, imagine because I wasn't nourishing myself properly. And all consumed by, I guess, these sort of behaviors. And I guess what was complex was my eating disorder and my OCD was so connected. I had some real pure OCD thoughts and behaviors, but then some of these rituals I did was due to the fear of weight gain, which wasn't something I'd ever worried about. But when I developed an eating disorder, that was something that came and began to be quite prevalent for me. But I think, like you said before, and going back a little bit, there is a common misconception that eating disorders are an illness of vanity, and people do it because they want to look a certain way or they aren't happy with their appearance. And you know, I've met a lot of people that have fought an eating disorder, and that's very much or never, what am I trying to say here? It's often not the case. You know, trauma plays a big role in this, you know, food insecurity, family dynamics, genetics, biology, perfectionism. There's so many different things that can lead to someone struggling with this. So again, I think education is key. I've kind of taken a tangent there, but I felt like I needed to share that.
No, absolutely. And obviously an eating disorder is a clinical diagnosis. You know, it may be associated with obsessive thoughts about food or significant monitoring and management of their weight, you know, sort of extreme exercising or calorie counting and management and stuff like that. So this is obviously a broader umbrella, and Jen's obviously sharing just a perspective from her lived experience. When you talk about, you know, that recovery period, what was the turning point for you?
Oh, it's a great question. I guess just to give people some context of sort of what that looked like. So I started an outpatient service, more specifically to focus on my OCD, but it was very quickly that they acknowledged that not only was I just fighting OCD, there was some big issues around food. And I went into the outpatient service one day to get my observations done, which is something that they'd started doing just as they started to think that there may be something else going on other than just not just because OCD is awful, but as well as my OCD. And it was deemed that I was medically unstable at that point. So I was admitted to Starship Hospital and had 2 long stays, 3 months and then a further 1.5 months, and then spent a couple of weeks or a few weeks, in the psychiatric unit at Starship, the child and family unit. And so my initial turning point, I was almost forced into it. It wasn't necessarily a choice. And there's 2 ways to look at it. I often talk about the fact that I feel lucky that was forced upon me, but then also I would never wish anyone, you know, would have to get to that point to acknowledge that they needed support and help. I think, you know, a big thing for me was I was in my year 11 year at high school, and I saw all my friends, you know, going to parties and socializing and starting to go on dates. And that was a big turning point for me, wanting to be normal, whatever normal is, and able to engage in these sort of normal teenage things like my friends. But a huge part of my healing journey was around sort of therapy and goal setting and knowing what I was fighting for. And Jazz, my co-founder, says this a lot. You know, if you don't know what you're fighting for, it's impossible to get up and fight, especially when you've got something pretty loud in your head telling you to do 101 other things. So yeah, turning points, an interesting question. There wasn't one specific moment. It was kind of like a combination, or whatever the word is, of multiple little pieces coming together. But yeah, I think my family's belief in me and also seeing how broken it made everyone else was a big motivator for me too.
You talked about being forced into this. Did you mean that your parents sort of were shepherding you to treatment? Is that what you mean? Or
I guess it's so a big part of eating disorders in my experience is this denial phase. You know, you deny that there's an issue, which is very eating disorder sort of heavy, and that's the eating disorder leading the way there, out of the fear of what that means if you are to admit that there is, you know, a problem going on. I think for me, my parents, used a lot of tough love. They loved me through it all, but very, very early on, you know, from the onset, they really had to see me as a different person than my eating disorder. You know, I wasn't Genevieve that had, I was Genevieve that had anorexia. It wasn't Genevieve the anorexic. And I think language is so key when it comes to describing someone, just like someone with cancer isn't their cancer. You know, I had this illness, and that was something my parents really used in order to be hard and determined and tough on me, because they knew that they weren't fighting me, Genevieve, their loving, kind, beautiful daughter. They were fighting this awful beast that was consuming all elements of my life. So yeah, I think when I say force, there was some sense of force. Like I didn't necessarily choose to be admitted to hospital, but what I always say to people is, you know, you can be guided and people can tell you what you need to do, but ultimately the choice is up to you. And there was a big part of me that was so exhausted of fighting this relentless battle that I wanted to fight, even though it was terrifying.
Mm. And you spoke about your parents being so supportive of you, no judgment in some ways. Did you find others were just as compassionate to you? Or did you feel that there were others who kind of sort of looked at you and saying, this is a choice that you've made. You could just snap out of it if you wanted to?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways. I didn't tell a lot of people. I think a lot of people knew because obviously I wasn't going to school for a long period of time and rumors get round. But, you know, I was met with a lot of compassion. I think, you know, I look at my mum and she's very open. She's gone through her own journeys with mental illness, not an eating disorder, but she has this empathy and understanding that, you know, people who perhaps haven't fought their own journey or supported someone through their journey may not have. My dad's in the medical field and even he found it really difficult, and he admits this, to get his head around how his food-loving daughter was just so consumed by these awful thoughts of unhealthy, you know, beliefs and coping mechanisms. And so I think, you know, what I was shown was a lot of compassion. But I think there was a lot of fear in people around me and probably a lot of questions of how did we get to this, you know, how did we get to this point? And I think due to the lack of education, I mean, heck, before I fought an eating disorder, I wouldn't have been able to understand why someone couldn't just eat, because it's something we do since the day we're born, right? But having gone through it, I understand it's much more complex than, you know, picking up a sandwich and eating it.
You briefly talked about, you know, for example, seeking therapy, being hospitalized as part of the recovery journey. Can you maybe paint for our audience what's a typical treatment program or recovery journey?
Yeah, this is great. I mean, what would I like to be a typical treatment program? I think, you know, it's important to acknowledge that there's a real lack of resource and support. And something I find really difficult is when people come to me and say, hey, Jen, I told my doctor I'm struggling, but now I'm on a wait list, or I'm not sick enough, you know, which is a really common belief when you're fighting an eating disorder. Your eating disorder is constantly telling you that you're not sick enough. You could be on your deathbed and you still won't be sick enough. So when that's being reinforced by the system or the care that's available, that is really challenging. I guess standard, and again, there's no sort of standard way, but, you know, when people ask me sort of what is the process, going to your GP is something that I always recommend as a starting point. They can connect with the sort of public services that exist to support individuals that are struggling. If private's an option, which part of my journey did involve private therapy, which again, I'm incredibly grateful for because I understand that's incredibly inaccessible to a lot of people, then, you know, that's something that's that can be really helpful too. And I guess in an ideal world, you know, it's MDT, so it's having, you know, your dietitian, your psychologist, your psychiatrist, you know, having a team of people around you. But that's also not very realistic for majority of people. One, because there's not enough trained professionals working in this space, but also because cost is such a significant barrier to getting support. So yeah, it's really challenging. I find it really difficult to talk about how important it is to reach out for help when there is such limited help available.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to sort of mention as well that, you know, Clearhead is an EAP program that is available to provide funded support, including support with eating disorders, if your company is using us. And so they are, in the context of what Jen mentioned, where it's costly for you to self-fund or the public wait list is really long, looking at potentially support through your employer, whether that's for yourself or actually for a lot of employers, they provide that same access to the family members of the employees. You know, so don't struggle alone. This might be a good bridging point for while you're waiting on the public list, for example. So awesome. Well, I'm glad you kind of sort of talked about how there isn't this one thing that kind of was a turning point for you. When you think about in the context of the individuals that are out there right now in the world who are struggling with eating disorders, who are in what they call the pre-contemplative phase, where they actually don't see that they have a problem or not willing to acknowledge there is a problem, what can individuals who love them do to help them get to that turning point where they are ready to accept some help?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of individuals that reach out to me are those, obviously there's the people that are going through the journey themselves, but a lot of people that reach out are parents and carers or teachers and supporters. And obviously I don't have all the answers, but I think, what's really, really important is that you acknowledge that, it is common for there to be a sense of denial, and it can be a really difficult conversation to have. So, being really conscious of when you decide to have that conversation, coming at it from a really empathetic, perspective and saying, I'm worried about you, or I feel like you've lost your spark, or you're not sort of as engaged in conversations as you used to be. I think one of the best pieces of advice I can give to people that are worried about someone is to let them know that you're there to listen. I think as human beings, we always want to fix people, but sometimes what people need is just a safe place to listen. I think supporting them to get that professional support can be very, very helpful as well. And reminding them that sort of their now doesn't have to be there forever, that things can get better, and that you're going to support them without judgment is really, really important too. And educate yourself. There's a lot of stuff out there. I think, if you're supporting someone through a journey, educate yourself around sort of language that's important to use, because, telling someone in the normal world that they look great is probably the best compliment, but telling someone with an eating disorder that they look great can be incredibly detrimental, because your eating disorder ends up turning that into 50 other statements that aren't remotely connected, but that's just the way it works.
I'd love for you to maybe explore further on this. What are the right ways in which to communicate or use the language so that, as you said, you don't turn what is a positive compliment into something that perpetuates someone's behavior that is unhealthy?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, there's a whole, I ended up writing a book last year called Bite Back. This is it. There's a whole section in here around language and how you can support people who are struggling with an eating disorder. But, a lot of individuals that I spoke to throughout this process talked about the fact that a lot of comments are around just eat. Why can't you just eat? And I asked them what their sort of thoughts were and how that made them feel. And for a lot of them, it was this feeling of feeling really invalid, and that they'd chosen to be this way, and that their struggles weren't real. And so I think, like I said, being really conscious of language and how you speak to the individual, reminding yourself that they're not choosing to be this way, they're fighting something, separating them from the illnesses is really, really important too. It's complex, and I think you need to be aware that often you will be met with potentially anger or denial, like I said before, because it can be really hard to hear, especially if the eating disorder's, steering the ship as opposed to the healthy person or healthy self that you're talking to. Kind of a rule of thumb that I have and really encourage people is to just not comment on people's appearance, comment on their attributes as opposed to how they look. There's this thing that I heard recently. It's unless someone's got spinach in their teeth, toilet paper stuck to their shoe, or their skirt tucked into their dress, just don't comment on people's bodies, because you never ever know what they're going through. And there's so much more to a human being than the way they look.
And it's so interesting, isn't it? Especially if you think about, I believe the Taylor Swift documentary sort of outlined her sharing her journey about this and how difficult it was for her, but from everyone else on the outside probably looked at someone who was really happy, really successful, and probably has a lot of resources that you and I will never have access to, but she herself was struggling through her journey. So I think you can't make those assumptions in any way.
No, and that's the thing with eating disorders as well. There's this common misconception that it's only, young white females that experience an eating disorder, and actually, regardless of who you are, where you come from, how much money you have or don't have, or, your ethnicity, religion, eating disorders don't discriminate, and everyone can be, affected by one.
And there is now data that shows, young men are the one that are increasingly experiencing this. Have you seen that in the lived experience community?
I have. And what I've also seen is more men speaking about it, which I think is really awesome too. I know a few males that are advocating in the eating disorder space here in New Zealand who are such sort of lights or voices of hope for others that are struggling, because for so long it's been very focused on females. But you're completely right. It's important to acknowledge that, any genders can experience eating disorders, and actually our trans community is hugely affected by eating disorders as well. They really do or can affect people from all walks of life. But yes, more men that are struggling, which is always upsetting to hear when anyone's struggling with an eating disorder, especially if you've been through it and know the pain of it. But I also find hope in the fact that they are talking about it, because then that's inspiring other people along the way.
So let's maybe go back to your journey. And we spoke about how, I guess, you reflected on what was potentially the trigger for you and sort of led to a long journey, a hard journey, where you managed to get through recovery. You feel you're not the same person you were even 10 years ago, right? But we know, for example, with mental illness, and that there tends to be a period in which you might relapse. So, have you yourself ever relapsed since you've sort of come out the other side initially? And how do you help people think about sort of relapsing in the context of recovery?
Yeah, great question. I think, which many of you will be aware of, recovery is not a straight line. If it was easy, then we wouldn't, have these issues or people struggling in the first place. And so I think if you are going through your own journey or supporting someone, it's important to be aware that they're often, or majority of the time, I'd even, feel comfortable saying there will be slip-ups, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, a little flip to the side. And for many people, it can just be a common part of the process. I think, I get asked this all the time because people say to me, I relapsed, I've failed. And I think it's, so important to know that if you relapse, it doesn't mean all your progress is lost. It means you've had a little blip in the road and you've still got the tools and skills that you had before to overcome it and keep on fighting. And I think also relapse can be a really wonderful opportunity, not that I'd recommend it, but to learn and figure out what parts of your journey you still need to work on. In terms of relapsing, I went through a period, and this is years ago now, where it was after my sort of second hospital admission. So I was still, very much in the thick of it, but had come a long way, where I had, and I don't even know if you'd necessarily call it a relapse, but a big blip in the road where things felt like they kind of went back to square one. And from the point I'm at now, I can see that I definitely didn't go back to square one. I was definitely a lot further ahead than I had been originally, but it was really hard not to get annoyed at myself and blame myself and find that strength to go through that process again. But yeah, it's a tricky journey, and like any sort of mental health challenge, the recovery process is never linear. It's never straight. So if anyone's going through that or supporting someone, I guess my best advice is just be kind to yourself and get back on the path to healing.
One of the things that would be interesting to tease with you is recovery purely just in the eyes of the individual? For example, if you say you've recovered, but everyone else around you kind of look at you and say, well, you're still doing all these behaviors that doesn't quite look like you've recovered. How do you deal with it from that perspective, whether for the individual or the people around them that's kind of noticing and wanting them to kind of not scare them that they haven't actually achieved what they wanted to achieve? Yeah,
completely. That's such an interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer for you on the spot. I guess, like I was saying before, language is something that's really helped me in my healing journey, and I've always found the word recovered very black and white. You're either recovered or you're not recovered. And in many ways, I'm like, does that give the impression to people that you're either one or the other? You're not sort of in this constant flow of recovery. And I guess the way that I look at it is I'm incredibly well, and by definition, whatever the definition is, I'm recovered, but I call or I talk to people about the fact that I'm now free. I have this freedom that I never had when I was in the thick of it, things that I wasn't able to do then, like socializing and eating without anxiety and not being consumed by thoughts and opening a door once instead of 4 times because my OCD told me I had to, or my family were going to be hurt. I have the freedom just to live a normal life. In terms of your question, that's such an interesting one. And I guess if I have seen that, and I've probably been through stages in my journey, back when I was struggling, that I told people that I was a lot better than I actually knew I was inside. And so I think at some points in the process, there may be some tough conversations, but something that really helped me in terms of like a really practical activity that you could do with someone that is struggling to, to detach or realize where they are on their journey is a T chart. So my mum did this with me and it was really helpful. And on one side, we wrote all the things I thought my eating disorder was giving me / all the things I wanted to hold on to that my eating disorder was giving me. Control wasn't control. And then on the other side, everything a life free from my eating disorder would give me. And it was this sort of hard evidence that actually fighting for that freedom was going to be really important because it was going to give me so much more. And that what I thought my eating disorder was giving me was actually not accurate at all. But yeah, in terms of your question, that's a really, really complex one. And it may be just asking the individual questions and getting them to sort of think about, where they are in their journey. And if they really do think they're at the end point, whatever the end point is, I don't think there's such thing.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's about maybe taking the time to sit down with them to determine, as you said, what success looks like. And therefore being able to then objectively look at whether the thoughts or the behaviors or the emotions are aligning to what they have defined successes for themselves and help them be a mirror for them without having to be the one telling them what to do.
Absolutely. And again, having that conversation without judgment and coming from a really caring and empathetic place is going to be important too.
Are there anything that you do today that you do as a way of making sure you never relapse, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I've been asked this before and it's not something I focus all this time on. Like I don't worry about relapsing. I feel like where I'm at in my journey now, I'm so aware and in tune with myself and my body and my mind and my thoughts that if I ever noticed anything creeping in, I'd have the tools and the skills to, combat it sort of straight away. I mean, obviously, I hope so. I think in terms of staying well, something that I continue to do is I'm really open. I talk to people if I'm feeling overwhelmed, if I'm feeling stressed. In the past, I would have kept that to myself and used food as a way to sort of control that. Whereas now I'm much more open and the moment I start feeling overwhelmed or stressed, I'll tell someone and ask for some support. Therapy is something I still engage in on an infrequent basis, but I know it's there if I need it. And I find talking to someone's really, really important. I'm actually, and this is obviously an individual thing for everyone, but I still take medication and that's something that I'm not ashamed of. And I do not because I'm unwell, but because it helps me stay well. And it's one of my ways of keeping on top of my mental health. And actually what's really cool now is I went through years of having a really unhealthy relationship with exercise. And through that sort of process of recovery and healing, I'm in a really wonderful place where actually moving my body, whether it's stepping outside and going for a walk around the block or going to a gym class with friends, is actually a really wonderful way for me to look after my own well-being. So there's multiple things I do to stay well, not necessarily to prevent a relapse, but just to make sure I'm looking after my mental health, prioritizing, especially because I work in this field, making sure I'm putting time aside for myself and not overcommitting.
The other thing we always say is, prevention is better than cure. You talked about how when you reflected, the trigger for you was, watching something on the news that as a young child you probably shouldn't see. And that sort of was the catalyst to all these behaviors as a way of coping of the scariness of the world. Are there practical things a parent can do to create an environment that would prevent an eating disorder? Or is that something that's just too complex to ever really do?
No, I can talk to a couple of things there. I think, it's really important to be conscious of how you speak about yourself and your own body and the way that you nourish yourself and in front of others. I think, creating a really a really open environment within the household where people feel like they can talk if they are struggling. And I think role modeling that behavior is a really big part of that. But in terms of like my advice, I just always say to parents, like, just be really aware, like there's always little ears listening, like be really conscious of how you speak to yourself, because people do pick up on that. And the language that you use in the house, not talking about diets and weight loss and, judging other people's appearance or the way that they nourish themselves. I think you've just got to be really aware. And I also don't want you to stress over it and spend every waking hour worried that it's going to happen, because unfortunately in some regards, these things are out of your control, but also it's definitely not a journey everyone faces. Something that's been really important for many people that I interact with is this sort of all food fits, not moralizing food as good and bad food. All food can fit into into someone's, life, and not sort of restricting certain food groups. But yeah, I think, open dialogue is really important too.
Yeah, I think role modeling what a healthy coping mechanism or behavior is also really key. When we talk about eating disorders as a way of dealing with all the negative emotions and thoughts that a person has, or if you think about self-harming, people who cut themselves, it's a way in which they're dealing with what they're experiencing in their inner world. And what you can do as a parent is to teach your child really healthy ways in which to deal with negative emotions and thoughts, so that they don't have to rely on what we consider more maladaptive mechanisms in which to cope.
Yeah, I love that. And I think also on that note, and I imagine we'll get here if we have time, but, social media is so complex in itself. And I think, in a home environment, being very sort of having boundaries in place, I think is important for everyone around access to social media and who people are following, etc.
Absolutely. And maybe just to kind of close off the bit I was saying, so what are healthier ways in which to cope? It's learning how to meditate, maybe using therapy we spoke about already, journaling, maybe tracking your mood and understanding what your triggers are and what makes you happy and what makes you unhappy. These are all tools that are available in Clearhead, but, there are lots of ways in which you don't need to use tech as a way to do these things as well. And that sounds good. I think it'd be interesting to kind of explore what have you learned having created this community of lived experience individuals going through, eating disorders and other challenges. What have you learned from that?
I have learned so much. I've learned that everyone has a story, and often you can't tell if someone's struggling just by looking at them. That it's important to always be kind, again, because you don't know what people are going through. I've learned that, shame cannot survive vulnerability, and that when one person shares their story, it creates a really safe place for others to open up and do the same. I know when I sort of shared my story publicly for the first time, the amount of messages I got from people in my direct sort of networks, as well as strangers, made me realize that there's so many people that are struggling in silence. But yeah, I learned that it's really important to seek the support that you need. And just like you'd go and, see a doctor if you broke your leg, that if your mind's feeling a bit broken, that you access that same support. I've also learned that humans are incredibly resilient, and, in those moments where you just can't possibly believe that you can keep on going, you absolutely can. You absolutely can. And when it comes to sort of anxiety, one of the most important lessons I learned throughout my journey is that it's temporary and it can't hurt you, and that it always passes. And yes, it feels incredibly uncomfortable, but one of the best things you can often do is sit with it and let it pass, instead of trying to avoid the feeling. I've learned so much, and I often talk about the fact that although I wouldn't go through what I went through again if I could have the choice, because it was awful, I obviously can't change the past, but I've learned so much from that process that I'm now able to share with other people. I feel really privileged in that way, that I've managed to turn something really crappy into something really positive that is helping others.
And that's so beautiful that you found that sense of purpose through your sufferings and make meaning out of what you've gone through. And that's a huge part of resiliency, is that you take the time to make meaning on why things happen to you and how you are better off having gone through it. Maybe you could talk about as well, we spoke about now in this context, the power of peer support through communities. We talked about the value of professional help. We talked about the love from our parents and what they can do. What about workplaces? Can workplaces really do anything beyond what I mentioned before, which is, for example, providing EAP support that's funding therapy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when it comes to sort of workplace wellbeing and supporting individuals, obviously this isn't my direct line of work, but what I've seen work really well in other businesses is having these really open discussions and getting people in to talk about mental health and making sure it's a workplace where there's really open dialogue and opportunity to speak up if you need to. There's always a lot of sort of noise around Mental Health Awareness Week, which is great and so important, but also mental health awareness is something we need to be focusing on every single day because, the person sitting at the desk opposite you might really be struggling and are unable to share that with someone else. It can be complex, but, I've heard of workplaces doing sort of like fitness challenges or press-up challenges. And obviously, if you're struggling with an eating disorder, that can become quite complex in itself. And so I just think being really mindful when making company-wide decisions of where you want your focus to be, that it's going to be helpful and not harmful.
That's great. And, we obviously talked about the broader support network. We talked about the challenges of the public health system to truly provide resources in a timely manner. One of the ways in which you've tried to do your bit for the ecosystem is you created this eating disorder app where there's more resources out there. Maybe you can start off with sharing with us, what are some of the resources that are on that app? And why did you put it in there?
Yeah, no, great question. So I created an app or co-created an app called Love Your Kite with an amazing lady called Hannah who started something called the Kite program. And I guess what I was looking at was what I was facing was there was a lot of people coming to me that were struggling and unable to access support or sitting on wait lists. And it was almost about trying to fill that gap. We make it really clear with Love Your Kite. It's not an instead of, it's an as well as, use this as well as your professional support. I run support groups with a friend of mine who also is a lived experience advocate, and those are fortnightly. And with those groups, we provide an activity that they do throughout the week and bring back to group, and we reflect and go through it. And a big part of my sort of healing journey was doing these really practical tasks, whether it was gratitude lists or whether it was, the T chart that I was talking about before in terms of, what my eating disorder was giving me versus what other things were. And I guess when we broke it down, we were looking at all the different complexities that come with an eating disorder, whether it be shopping for food or clothes shopping or socializing at events, going to birthday parties, Christmases, etc. And decided to create this really simple app that gives you one activity a day. And I know for a lot of people that can be frustrating because they want to do a million activities at once. And some of the activities are simply to sit and breathe, but it's giving people the opportunity to focus for 5 minutes or 10 minutes of their day wholeheartedly on their healing from their eating disorder and to choose modules or kites as we call them that feel relevant to where they are on their journey, whether it's finding hopeful podcasts or, like I said before, clothes shopping, food shopping, dealing with festivities, etc. So it's really sort of user-led in terms of people choose what feels relevant to them. You get one activity a day that range from a number of different things.
I'm curious did you learn, once people actually started using the app, what resources you thought would be helpful, were not helpful, and what were resources that you didn't even think about, but then you had to develop once you got more user feedback? Were there any changes that you made?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've definitely added a few since we started because there were people that were like, oh, what about this? I didn't find anything that felt relative to this. What we found as well is, like I said, some of the activities, we encourage people to do it alongside like a handwritten journal so they can write their bits and pieces down. And a few people found it frustrating that not every activity had a sort of a written element to it. And so we kind of put options in there that people can write things down in this activity or simply just do it as it stands. I think we're constantly learning. It's a tricky one. I run a charity full time, and Love Your Kite's just something that I do on the side, and it almost needs to be someone's full-time job because I feel like it deserves so much more time and energy. But the feedback over the years, I think it's 2, 3, I don't even know how long we've had it for now, has been really positive, and it's like a friend in your pocket. It's always there. It's private. A lot of people sort of use it as a bridge to support, as opposed to, whether they've got a diagnosis or not. It encourages them to seek that next step and reflect on where they're at in their journey. But yeah, technology is an interesting one. But yeah, we continue to learn.
Jen, we've talked about so many things and in terms of like what potentially could cause an eating disorder, what your personal journey is towards recovery, what the treatments are out there, what the challenges are. And is there anything we've missed that you would like to cover in this broad spectrum of what we've discussed so far?
Oh my goodness, we've talked about so many things, so many I can't even remember. I think, I talked about how, accessing support can be really difficult, but I want to also, be hopeful in this, that there is some incredible support out there and there's some incredible work being done in the eating disorder space. I sit on a couple of advisory boards and there's some awesome stuff being done around sort of education for schools and GPs, so they're able to acknowledge or assess people in a more timely and effective manner. So not all hope is lost. There still is hope out there. And I guess for anyone that's supporting someone through an eating disorder, I really encourage you to prioritize yourself and your own well-being, because it is incredibly draining and it's difficult seeing someone you love suffer. So it's so important that you look after you too. And if you are fighting your own battle, that you know that you are worthy and deserving of support, and that recovery or a free life is entirely possible.
And what about for those who are supporting those who are struggling?
Yeah, be kind to yourself. I often find, and it was in my case too, that I'd take my anger out on the ones I loved because it was easier to than on a complete stranger or a doctor. So, my parents definitely got the brunt of it. I think it's important to educate yourself, to be direct, but also really empathetic, to validate their feelings and I guess avoid blame. But like I was saying before, really make sure you take the effort to prioritize your own self. Look after yourself too, because the strain it has on family relationships and siblings is really real. And so make sure you prioritize time for yourself. And I often talk about the fact my parents held hope for me in the moments that I struggled to find my hope. That's hope myself. And that can be really difficult to constantly be positive and show your loved one that you believe in them, but it makes the world of difference. So, access support yourself. If you're struggling, make sure you're talking to someone about that as well.
When we think about eating disorders, we think about it in the context of people who are restricting food. Do you know if it's the same for individuals who are overeating instead?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, I haven't experienced those other things, but from the discussions I've had with people, it's interesting. Although everyone's journey is so unique, there are sort of common threads between them all, and almost the method, for the lack of a better word, in which people deal with these things, whether it's, binging and purging or restricting or overeating or exercising, the thoughts can often be really, really similar. And again, that's from my experience and the discussions I've had. But yeah, eating disorders are very complex, and I could have the same diagnosis as someone, and my journey would be completely different. But there are definitely common threads between multiple diagnoses.
Yeah. In this case, we would broadly, put them under what we call disordered eating, which is a form of eating pattern that's a bit abnormal and do not quite meet the clinical criteria, but it can include, individuals who then, for example, eat for reasons beyond, hunger, for example, as a way of coping. And that sounds good. Well, anything else, Jen, before we sort of close off with our final questions?
No, not at all. I just appreciate the opportunity to share. And like I said, I'm not an expert, but hopefully you've got something from me today. I just really encourage you to seek the support that you need and know that life can be good again. And that, healing is a lot less lonely when you've got people fighting alongside you.
That's great. So our final question, and we ask all our guests, is what's your one wellbeing practice to stay well, Jen?
Well, this is going to sound like I've been paid to say this, but we've just recently signed up to Clearhead, and it's been amazing for us in the workplace. It's sort of 5 minutes of my day, if that I commit to putting myself first and checking in with myself. So that's been super helpful. So thank you for creating such a wonderful platform.
Oh, I totally did not expect that, but thank you, Jen.
No, it's great. I'm not joking.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.